Assalamu alaikum. Congratulations to those who've made it to the 4th semester. As you can see, I'm back with another subject, this time with a difference. Last semester we were doing prose 2 and we did travelogues and we did short stories. This semester the module that we have is American literature, and I'm going to take you through the different movements that are very, very important in American literature. You might think that I am skipping over some of them, but if I do so, it will only be because those are movements for which we will not be having any text. So this module, because it's the only one you have in American literature, is going to be a kind of mixed one. My attempt in this module is going to be to make sure that you have examples from all the major movements in American literature, and at the same time you have exposure to the different forms of literature, to the different genres of literature, as they are called. So we're going to do prose and we're going to do poetry, a bit of it, and my attempt is going to be to do a drama also. We have some very interesting writers in this module, and I have tried to make it as interesting for you as possible. But you need to remember a couple of things. What I'm going to do is only to introduce you to American literature. As I have told you in the previous semesters also, this course is designed not to give you an in-depth study of any one particular text, but to introduce you to many different texts so that whatever you have a special interest in, you can take up. Now, because you're in the 4th semester, you will be doing a certain amount of research. And in introducing you to different writers and movements and different forms of literature, my attempt will be to give you a glimpse of all the material that is available in American literature. All right, so whatever we're going to be doing here is just going to be an introduction. For example, we'll do one essay. It's a longish essay by Emerson, and we'll do one play. But since it takes a long time to do these things, so do not expect this to be a detailed teaching module of all the different genres, because the time constraints do not allow us to go into that. We were supposed to have been introduced to each other, but I'm sure you already know my name by now, and you also know that this module that I'm going to be teaching you is on American literature. So without further ado, let us see what we have on the PowerPoint for today. And mind you, I want you to approach this subject, as all other subjects, with an open mind. If you come across an idea that does not conform with your idea, do not reject it outright, because as students of literature, you and I have to accept different points of view. And since we are basically human beings, we need to live and work with other human beings, and in order to do that, we need to know what other people think like. So when I say that this is a module which is going to focus on the best in American literature, what I am actually aiming for is to give you just a brief outline of all the material that is available. I'm not saying that other books or other poems or dramas are not good, but I have selected these because they are representatives of the different movements. So let us see the different movements and the different time periods in which those movements took place. You will also see that certain movements overlap each other, or they run parallel to each other, so that when there is one movement that has been introduced, you will also see another movement running parallel to that. So don't get confused, it's not all that difficult. And this lecture, as always, is the introductory lecture. So when we trace the history of American literature, we go back to the Puritan times, and that is the 15th and 16th century. You know that Puritanism was a movement in Europe, and the followers of that movement did not advocate or did not appreciate people going into the arts and culture, or singing and dancing, or any form of entertainment. So the dates that you are given for the Puritan movement in the United States is 1472 to 1750. And the bulk of the work that was done in American literature during this time, he says, comprises of histories, journals, personal poems, sermons, and diaries. So sermons forming a very important chunk of the literature of this time. Most of this literature is either utilitarian, very personal, that is not written from the point of view of the public's consumption, or religious. So there has to be a purpose to writing at this time in the history of American literature. The movement is called Puritan because the majority of the writers during this period were strongly influenced by Puritan ideals and values. This is just what I told you. The Puritan movement in Europe had an impact on literature and society across the ocean. And you know that because some parts of what is now United States started off as being colonies of Britain or colonies of European countries, therefore whatever was happening in Europe had a direct impact on what happened in the United States. So if there was Puritanism in Europe, there was definitely Puritanism in the United States. And you know that there was a lot of religious persecution at this time, and the Puritans were a very strong group of people who believed that the Christian church needed to be purified of all that had been brought into it. So Puritanism in England had a direct impact on the society of the United States, and most of the literature that was produced during this time was either utilitarian, if it was for public consumption, or very personal. That meant that nobody else was supposed to read it, or it was very religious, and that again meant that it would be either sermons or history or something like that. Okay, so so much for the Puritan movement. Jonathan Edwards is one who continues to be recognized from this period. He was a Christian preacher, philosopher, and theologian. Edwards is widely acknowledged, and this is within quote marks, to be America's most important and original philosophical theologian. and of course one of America's greatest intellectuals. One of the most famous sermons still available is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and this sermon is supposed to be a classic of early American literature. So you see, this period is classified as the early American period. This was followed by the Age of Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment movement, and it was called Enlightenment obviously because of the influence of science and logic. This period is also marked in the US by political writings. When you have science and logic coming in, you definitely have a very volatile political situation. Genres of this time, and this period is 1750 to 1800. Remember, the Puritan age was 1472 to 1750. That is more than 200 years. But the Enlightenment movement occupies only 50 years. But in those 50 years, there was a lot that was written, a lot that was created. So because this was the time of political awareness, the different genres in which literature was created included political documents, speeches, and letters. Benjamin Franklin is one person who belongs to the Age of Enlightenment. A lot of you will have heard of the name of Benjamin Franklin as an inventor, as a scientist, but very few of you will be aware of the fact that Ben Franklin was also a man of letters. So amongst the different branches of knowledge that he dabbled in was of course science. He was a statesman, patriot, and publisher. So a very multi-talented man was Benjamin Franklin. He's well known for his autobiography and the fact that there is a lack of emphasis and dependence on the Bible and more use of common sense and science. The Bible was not totally forgotten, but you see, because a lot of these people who came to what is now the United States were running away from religious persecution in Europe, they sort of started to feel that the Bible was not the only text which could be adhered to. Contrary to what you had during the Puritan age, when people were very, very religious and there was no concept of entertainment, in the Age of Enlightenment, you had a very strong impact of science and common sense. So the focus is shifting slightly from religion or from Christian beliefs to the belief that man needs to use his mind, his brains. Human beings have been given a brain, have been given the ability to rationalize, and therefore they must use that. So the Age of Enlightenment was one that focused on the use of the ability of the human being to think and decide for himself. Okay, now this period, that is from 1800 to 1840, is known as Romanticism, and the movement of Romanticism, or the Age of Romanticism in the United States, follows the Age of Enlightenment. That was from 1750 to 1800. Now you see that parallel movements were also in place in Europe, but what you had in the United States is slightly different. And because Americans like to think that they are different from the rest of the world, and especially Europe, so you had to have American movements in literature with a slight difference. So Romanticism, he says, was a literary and artistic movement of the 19th century, and it rose against the age of enlightenment. Remember, when you were doing English literature, you had the neoclassics in England, who concentrated on reason and logic, and who followed the pattern of the Greek classicists. So in the same way, in the United States, you had the Age of Enlightenment, or the movement that was named Enlightenment, and this was followed by Romanticism, which was another 40 years. Now you see that when you move from the Puritan movement or the Puritan age, you have more than 200 years there. So change taking place very slowly. And yet, when you have the Age of Enlightenment, that is just 50 years. And from the Enlightenment, when you move to Romanticism, the time is shortened still further, and it is reduced to 40 years. So 1800 to 1840, the beginning of the 19th century, and up until almost the middle of the 19th century. So the movement of Romanticism placed a lot of focus on fancy, imagination, emotion, nature, individuality, and exotica. Anything that was different had to be written about, had to be created. What it actually entailed was a movement from personal and political documents to entertaining ones. So if you go back to the end of the 15th century, where you have Puritans rising up and Puritans maintaining that stronghold, less than let's say the first half of the 19th century now is devoted to Romanticism, which meant that literature that was being created was going to be entertaining. It was going to be literature that is created for purposes of enjoyment. And this is a very important movement, and because we'll be doing work that is coming from the Romantic movement, or that has obvious overtones of Romanticism. Therefore, I have listed the main characteristics of this movement for you. Let us quickly go through these points. There was a preoccupation with social and political affairs. This is something that is coming from the Age of Enlightenment. There were realistic topics based on folk tales and ballads. There were a lot of folk tales that the colonial powers coming from Europe had brought with them. And then there were the folk tales and ballads of the natives who occupied the land that is now termed the United States. Then there was a focus on plain feelings and true emotions. If you go back to Wordsworth and Coleridge in England, you see you have these parallel movements across the ocean. You have the same type of literature being produced. So when you had Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats and Shelley in England, you had American writers and American poets focusing on emotions and feelings, and there was a definite focus on the freedom of the individual, the freedom of the individual human being to feel and think for himself or herself, and to create literature which would reflect those feelings and emotions. Nature in typically idealized form, embracing tradition, introducing cultural nationalism, exploring national history, bringing back medieval national roots, including history of language, institutions, thought, and architecture. And all this, you see, is represented in the literature that is being created at this time. There was a rejection of artificialities. Again, I'll give you the example of Wordsworth, because you people have a very good idea of Wordsworth from the poetry that he wrote and the criticism that he gave us. Again, I'll try to draw parallels so that it is easy for you to accept American literature and the movements taking place therein as being parallel to movements in Europe. So when he says there's a rejection of artificialities, Wordsworth's theory of literary criticism states that poetry needs to be in the language of ordinary people. Poetry should not use high-flown language. So there's this rejection of artificialities. There is, of course, a great deal of imagination. You go back to your Coleridge, you go back to your Keats, and you see how imagination was working there. And then it has to be simple in style and popular in demand. Again, the Romantics that you had in England, they reflected. I'm not introducing American writers at this point, because I want you first to keep in mind the fact that these are parallel movements taking place simultaneously with the movements in Europe, but removed thousands of miles away from Europe. So it had to be simple, popular in appeal, creative, innovative, exploratory in approach, and inclusive in interest. That is, it must include interests of many different classes and groups of people. So if you see what Wordsworth is writing about, he's writing about what he sees in nature, and he's writing about going away from the world of man and living in the lap of nature. If you see what Coleridge was doing, Coleridge was bringing in the supernatural with the rime of the ancient mariner, and seeing those ghosts and life in death and death in life. He brings in those ideas, and it has to be done in such a way that there is innovation and it is appealing to the reader. Now, the difference that you see between American Romanticism and, let's say, British or European Romanticism is that as far as the topics were concerned, purely American topics were introduced, and these included frontier life. People who were going to lands which have been unexplored by Europeans, where the Native Americans were still living their lives according to their cultures and traditions, where European standards of life or the European concept of life had not encroached. So that category, which is termed frontier life, was a very important part of the literature that is being created during the American Romanticism. And then he gives you names of certain writers who are as diverse as Cooper, James Fenimore Cooper, Edgar Allan Poe. How many of you remember Edgar Allan Poe? Yes, we did a few short stories in the last semester, and you will remember what I told you then, that the short story was originated in England, and then it moved from there to Europe and to the United States. So you had Poe, you didn't have Thoreau, you didn't have Emerson, but you're going to have Emerson in this semester. Dickinson, Emily Dickinson is a renowned poet. Hawthorne and Melville. These are some of the names that are amongst the great American romanticists. And as I told you before, some of these movements overlapped other movements, and Romanticism is particularly evident in the works of the New England Transcendentalists like Emerson. And you know, we're going to start this module with the writings of Emerson. So whatever I'm telling you now, I want you to remember this. Keep this in mind so that when we are doing Emerson's essay, I can refer you to what I told you earlier. Now, what I have here is a list of some of the prominent American romanticists, and you will notice one thing, that this list does not limit itself to people who were coming from England, because Romanticism is European in origin, and also because in the United States you had representatives from all the different European countries. You had Germans, Swedes, Portuguese, Spaniards, Italians, French, and of course English, and people from many different countries in Europe. So this list that I am quickly going to go through is representative of the fact that the people who came to the United States were not just from one country or of one nationality, but they came from many different countries and were of varied and diverse nationalities. So Albert Bierstadt, George Catlin, William Cullen Bryant, Wilfred Campbell, James Fenimore Cooper, Emily Dickinson, these are some of the names that I just took, and there are some that have been added on to it. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Washington Irving, Archibald Lampman, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, James Russell Lowell, Edward McDowell, Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, you did his writings in the previous semesters, Charles Sangster, who is a Canadian poet, Henry David Thoreau, John Greenleaf Whittier, etc., etc., etc. And there are many names that I have not even mentioned. Okay, so we go on to the next movement, and the one that has just been referred to, and that is Transcendentalism. Now, this movement starts in 1840 and occupies only 15 years. You see how the time period is being reduced as far as movements are concerned. So Transcendentalism is something that is purely American, and it was a literary and philosophical movement of the 19th century. So we're still in mid-19th century, but the emphasis is shifting from Romanticism to what is termed as Transcendentalism. And these Transcendentalists were based in the geographical region that is known as New England, and the specialization or the speciality in their belief was that intuition and individual conscience transcend experience and thus are better guides to truth than are the senses and logical reason. So in some respects, they are setting off on a different path from the Age of Enlightenment. Because during the Age of Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment movement, advocated belief in the power of the mind, in the power of the human being. Transcendentalists had different opinions, and it's a movement that's very important in literature and philosophy. And the key statements of the doctrine of Transcendentalism include the essays that Emerson wrote, and one of these you will be doing, Self-Reliance, which is a very, very important essay by Emerson, in which he gives ideas that you may not have heard or read otherwise. So a few of the essays that have been mentioned here are Nature, the American Scholar, the Divinity School Address, the Transcendentalist, and of course Reliance. And of course Thoreau's Walden is thought to be the epitome of the transcendentalist way of thinking. The adherents to transcendentalism believed that knowledge could be arrived at not just through the senses, but through intuition and contemplation of the internal spirit. They professed skepticism of all established religions. Now you have to remember that they believed in spirituality, but all established religions, all what you would call organized religion, the Transcendentalists did not believe in that. Their belief was that mediation of a church was cumbersome to achieving enlightenment. So in other words, what they were advocating was direct communication between the human being and spirituality itself, or the human being and the divine being. And then of course he gives you a list of the Transcendentalists, and you see that Emerson's name is right there. You have Emerson and Thoreau, and you have Bronson Alcott, you have W.H. Channing, Margaret Fuller, and Elizabeth Peabody. So you see that it is only in the 19th century that you have the names of women also being included in American literature. Now, at the same time that you had the Romantic movement coming to an end, you have the movement of Realism taking birth or originating. And the times that have been given for Realism are slightly longer than those given for Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism had only 15 years. Realism is from 1865 to 1715. So about 40 years? No, 50 years. So again, half a century you had for the movement of Realism. And of course, Realism is a presentation in art of the details of actual life, without imagination, without fancy coming in. Realism is a literary movement that began during the 19th century and stressed the actual as opposed to the imagined or the fanciful. So not at all what Keats advocated, which was the world of fancy, the world of imagination. The realists tried to write truthfully and objectively about ordinary characters in ordinary situations. In other words, fiction came to be devoted to accurate representation and an exploration of American lives in various contexts. So a focus that moves from the imagination and the creative fancy of Romanticism to portraying events and people and objects and places as they really were, not glamorized, but a depiction of what life was like in reality. Realism is, of course, a sort of reaction to Romanticism, and it rejects the heroic, the adventurous, the unusual and unfamiliar subjects. Realism in turn was followed by naturalism, and there are some people who say that these are not just parallel movements, but they are the same movements. But you are being given the difference between these two movements, because the naturalists trace the effects of heredity and environment on people helpless to change their situations, whereas in realism you had a depiction of ground realities. American realism grew from the work of local color writers, and this is a term that is used specifically in American literature, and these were writers such as Bret Harte and Sarah Orne Jewett. And of course it is also evident in the writings of major American literary figures. I would say the gods of American literature, that is Mark Twain and Henry James. So an outgrowth of realism, naturalism is a literary movement that was followed and propagated by novelists at the end of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century. The naturalists tended to view people as hapless victims of immutable natural laws. So man is helpless, man cannot do anything, it's all up to nature. Early exponents of naturalism including Stephen Crane, and his short stories are also very famous, Jack London, Theodore Dreiser. Many others were also writing at the same time and in the same format. So regionalism, and now we are moving faster and faster. So regionalism was an outgrowth of realism. The tendency during this period of time was for writers to limit themselves to the geographical area to which they belonged. So you have Willa Cather, you have somebody like William Faulkner writing only about the South and how the cultural values are changing in the southern states. But one thing that regionalism did was that it presented the distinct culture of an area, and that included speech, customs, beliefs, and history. So he's not focusing on this diverse geographical landmass, but he's only limiting himself to the region that he knows a lot about and the region where he has his being. So if you have somebody like Willa Cather writing about a particular region, you also have Faulkner writing about the southern states and how life was lived in those states, and how with the passage of time southern values had changed. So that's something that Faulkner focused on. So it wasn't just speech, customs, it was also beliefs and history. Local color writing is also considered a part of regionalism, but regionalists, like the southern writers of the 1920s, usually go beyond mere presentation of cultural idiosyncrasies and attempt a sophisticated sociological or anthropological treatment of the culture of a region. So regionalists were more so as compared to the local color writers, whose canvas was distinctly smaller, and therefore the range of topics was also smaller than that of regionalists. Now, during the early part of the 20th century, and with the naturalists, the realists and the regionalists, we have come to the 20th century. So the early part of the 20th century, a movement originated in the United States that was known as imagism. And of course, Ezra Pound and Amy Lowell are the most important poets of imagism. The Imagist poets rejected 19th century poetic forms and language. So they sort of did away with whatever had been current and whatever had been liked and adhered to in the 19th century. So what they did was they wrote short poems that use ordinary language and free verse to create sharp, exact, and concentrated pictures. So no longer was there an indirect reference to an object or a person. Now the reference is very accurate. And one way that this can be achieved is by making sure that your poem is short and it's not as long as what, let's say, The Wasteland or The Fairy Queen. So you get the idea. Imagism used free verse, it advocated short poems, and the emphasis throughout it all was on exactness. Side by side with imagism, you have the movement of modernism. And the time that has been given for modernism is 1915 to 1946. That's about 30 years. Now, this was the time of confusion and disillusionment. Disillusionment and confusion because of the First World War, which was followed by the Second World War. In the First and Second World Wars, there was a lot of disillusionment and confusion because the promises that the United States government had made, it was unable to carry them out. Young men and young women later were recruited in the defense, and especially during the First World War, thousands of soldiers died not because they got bullet wounds or because they had bombs or devices detonating close to them, but because they could not get proper facilities. Remember, this is the time before the invention of the antibiotic, before the discovery of penicillin, which was made by Alexander Fleming. So when these soldiers got bullet wounds or got hit by a device, there was no proper care for them. There were no proper medications. So what happened was that their wounds started to fester. The wounds became poisonous. Gangrene set in, and you know how bad gangrene is. It's a poison in the blood. And when that poison sets in your blood, and when your wound does not get an antibiotic, human skin starts to rot. It starts to decompose and deteriorate. And there were thousands of men who died because they did not get proper medical treatment. Not because they had bullet wounds in the heart or in the head, but because they had wounds in the legs, in the arms, and those wounds festered. Those wounds became so bad that they eventually died. Now, this was before the onset of technology and before the age when medical science had made progress. So whatever was available was given to those people, and when those people came back home, sometimes their bodies were brought back, other times they were brought back with maybe legs missing, or maybe one leg missing, or an arm missing. There was a lot of disillusionment and despair. The reason why I'm going into such historical detail is that whatever was written during this time was a reflection of what was going on in American society. So, American society produced literature that could not be classified as romantic, that could not be classified as enlightened. It was modern because it showed what people in those days actually experienced. You see that literature or creative arts moved towards a depiction of royalty and the aristocracy to the problems and issues of the common man. So through these ages, very quickly the focus shifts from royalty and heads of states to aristocracy or people who are related to those heads of states, and then to people who are intellectuals, and slowly it comes to the ordinary people, the issues and problems of the ordinary people. Now, what you see at this point in time is also that these movements sort of merge into each other. Modernism, of which the proponents were Faulkner, Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Frost, presented issues that were faced by the common man, by the ordinary person, the man in the street. But they presented issues. They did not give solutions. They raised questions, but they did not give answers. This is not the type of literature that is classified as prescriptive literature. This is descriptive literature in which you are shown a situation, you are presented an experience, but you are not given an answer to the question. So these were writers who were raising questions about what was happening, but they did not have any solutions. They didn't have answers. And side by side with modernism, and a part of the age of modernism, was another movement that is known as the Harlem Renaissance. And this is the movement which originates in the 1920s, so the first half of the 20th century, but is concentrated in a specific region, and that region is Harlem in New York. You know that the Dutch, when they colonized the part that is known as Harlem, they wanted to give it the name of their own region in Holland. So because there was a Harlem in Holland, so they named this New Harlem. And this New Harlem, once the Dutch left, it was occupied by black people moving from the southern states after the Emancipation Proclamation, after Lincoln had abolished slavery. These people moved from the southern states and they sort of concentrated themselves in the Harlem area. And this was where they became aware of their rights and responsibilities and they started to put this in the form of literature, in the form of creative arts, and later, of course, also in the form of performance arts. You have that entire concept of jazz and the blues also coming at this point in time. So the Harlem Renaissance is one of the most important movements of the period. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance include Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, Langston Hughes, and Anna Bontemps. And one writer that's not been mentioned here is Zora Neale Hurston, and I'm mentioning her name because we're going to be doing her work during the course of this module. So the Harlem Renaissance and modernism end at the Second World War. What you have starting after the end of the Second World War and continuing into the 21st century is postmodernism / contemporary literature. Since the modern age stopped at 1945, postmodernism starts at 1946, and the material or the literature that was produced, the art that was created post 1945 is known as not only postmodernist art or literature, but is also known as contemporary art and literature. And there was a sort of mushrooming in literature and the arts in the 1970s, because that is when all those different movements were also coming together. They were all taking place at the same time. You had the civil rights movement, women wanting to vote. You had the African Americans coming out into the streets and wanting equal rights since slavery had been abolished. And the Emancipation Proclamation had been made public, so they wanted their rights. This is the time when you had a lot of people coming from different parts of the world, not just Europe, and settling in the United States. So you had that consciousness of the movements of different nationality. This is the time when America is known as the melting pot, into which all cultures and all nationalities sort of become a part of the bigger whole. This is also the time when you had the gay rights movements, when you had homosexuals coming out and wanting their own rights. This is also the time when you had the American Indians demanding their rights, wanting their land back. So after the Second World War, it was like all of the United States woke up one fine day and said, what about me? Why am I not getting my rights? Why am I always told my responsibilities, told my duties, and no mention is made of my rights? So this is the time when everyone in the United States was demanding their rights. So contemporary American literature is anything that was produced post 1945. And of course you have different techniques at this time also. There was temporal distortion. There were unreliable narrators. No longer did you have one person narrating the whole story and coming as the omniscient narrator who knows everything that is happening, everything that has happened, and everything that will happen in the future. They just did away with omniscient narrators and brought in unreliable narrators. And then of course you had the internal monologue. You had the postmodern techniques such as metafiction, ideogrammatic characterization, unrealistic names, and he gives you examples of that, absurdist plot elements and hyperbolic humor, deliberate use of anachronisms and archaisms, a strong focus on post-colonial themes, and a subversive commingling of high and low culture. So everything is coming together. It's like this huge pot, and you put everything into it. You put homosexuals into it, you put American Indians into it, you throw in African Americans, you throw in women, because they were also demanding their rights, and most important of all, they were demanding the right to vote. So everything was thrown into this, and out of this one sort of moving mass of humanity, the writers of the time took their themes, and these writers were Cormac McCarthy, Toni Morrison, Don DeLillo, Stephen King, yes, the one who wrote horror stories, Jonathan Franzen, Michael Chabon. And another thing that happened at this time in the postmodernist age and in the contemporary times is the rise of minority literatures, what are referred to as hyphenated literatures, literatures of the marginalized communities including African Americans, the Latinos or Chicanas, of Asians, particularly the Chinese. You had literature also written by Indians and Pakistanis after the yoke of colonialism was lifted. You know, all of you who have heard from parents will know that India and Pakistan were the colony of the British Empire, and one of the preconditions to Indians taking part in the war of the British against the Axis forces was that after the war, India would be divided into Muslim majority areas and Hindu majority areas, and a separate state would be carved out. So you have a lot of minority literatures. A lot of people from South Asia started to write in the last half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century. Some of the names mentioned here are Maxine Hong Kingston, Champa Lahiri, Thomas Rivera, Amy Tan, and there are a whole host of other writers. Now I'm going to stop here, but before I take leave, let me quickly go through what we have done today, so that we sort of recap and revise whatever we've done. This module is titled American Literature, and my attempt in this module will be to take you through the different movements that form a part of American literature, and to show you how what happens in society is reflected in the literature of the day and age. Human beings are full of emotions. They have thoughts and ideas and concepts, and these thoughts, ideas, concepts, emotions, sentiments, feelings have to have expression. So when we trace the background of American literature, we go back to the 15th century, the Puritan age. If you remember, I drew comparisons and I drew parallels with the movements in Europe, because the settlers in the United States, the settlers in America, had come from Europe. So the different nations or the different countries of Europe established colonies here, and because these people were running away from religious persecution, they had a very strong hankering to go back to Europe. But they could not do that because they were running away from the authorities. So the Puritan age starts from about 1470s and goes on to the 17th century. And during this time, the literature that is produced is of a very religious nature. There's no concept of entertainment in literature, and so what is produced is either religious texts like sermons, or very personal texts like diaries, or and from the Puritan age we move on to the age of enlightenment, and during this age poets and writers and artists in general started thinking that the ability to reason, the ability to logicalize is very important, and so the literature of the time reflected the enlightened version of the human being, or the human being that thinks. So the age of enlightenment is followed by the age of Romanticism, and I drew parallels of the Romantic movement in the United States with the Romantic movement in England, for example, and I also pointed out to you that just as Wordsworth, Coleridge and Keats were writing for the purposes of entertainment, apart from as a form of self-expression, so in the United States also the age of Romanticism produced texts, produced literature that focused on entertainment. It was personal, it was it was in the natural language, or as close to nature as possible, and it was very creative. There was a lot of use of the imagination here, and the movement of Romanticism was followed by Realism, and in Realism you had that fancy and imagination of the Romantic age taken away, and a concentration on what was actually happening, a focus on the experiences of ordinary human beings, not the aristocracy anymore. So the focus shifts in language, the focus shifts in content also, and of course Realism runs parallel with regionalism and with naturalism. In regionalism you had writers who were concentrating on one particular region, one particular geographical area. For example, you had William Faulkner writing about the southern states and whatever was important to the people in the South, particularly family values, for example. So you had peoples writing about one geographical region, and then side by side with this you also had the movement of imagism coming in, and the modernist approach, and the modernist approach is particularly relevant to us because there were a lot of questions that were raised in this age. Now mind you, this is an age in which questions are being raised without any answers being provided for them. And the questions were raised because there was a lot of confusion, disillusionment, and distrust. And I also pointed out the fact that this was a result of the First World War, and the fact that it was a war of attrition. There weren't so many people killed in battle as there were people killed as a result of the wounds that had been incurred, as a result of, let's say, gangrene breaking out. People were losing limbs. मैं थोड़ा सा और इसको करना चाहिए थी, मैंने वाइंड अप नहीं किया अभी प्रॉपर्ली.
ये बेल चेक करने के लिए लेके जा रहा हूँ. अभी बेल है नहीं, मैं तकरीबन 5 मिनट बाद आ जाऊँ.
5 मिनट बहुत है.
ठीक, थैंक यू.
And of course, the effect that the First World War had on society was so strong that the literature of the time also reflected the disillusionment and despair that was faced by society. The end of the Second World War is the time that's the cutoff point between modernism and postmodernism. And when we say that something is postmodern, we also say that it is contemporary. So the contemporary American literature is literature that is produced after the end of the Second World War. So 1946 to the present day. Whatever is produced is classified as being postmodern, is classified as being contemporary. The issues that are raised are issues that are contemporary. There was a lot of confusion in this time also, but the confusion that was a part of the modern age is resolved in postmodernism, in the sense that after the end of the Second World War, people within the United States, especially the marginalized communities, started to raise their voice. So what you see in the literature of the period is not just, let's say, the African Americans coming out in the form of the Harlem Renaissance that had been a part of, let's say, the modernist period, but also African Americans actually coming out into the streets and demanding their rights. Not just African Americans, but American Indians also waking up and wanting to know why their problems were not being addressed. You also had the Latinos or the Chicanas coming out and wanting to know why their issues were not being addressed. You also had a lot of people from Asia who had gone to the United States and who were being marginalized and who were being discriminated against. So the period after the Second World War was a very volatile one for the United States, and the literature of the time reflects all this. It reflects the issues of marginalized communities, of hyphenated communities, and it also shows post-colonial themes. It also shows the, let's say, the empire writing back, those areas that had been colonized. They started producing literature because those were people who had moved to the United States. So you had South Asian literature, you had the Chinese writing, you had the Japanese writing, you had people from all parts of the world settled in the United States, writing back and addressing social issues, religious issues, cultural and financial and economic reasons. So a lot of literature is being produced in contemporary times, and this is literature that is classified as contemporary American literature. I think that's enough for today. We'll do some more in the second lecture. Thank you and Allah Hafiz.